In a development that has drawn close attention from constitutional scholars rather than the general public, a new phase has emerged in the legal proceedings surrounding the New York indictment. Reports indicate that the defense strategy has incorporated a specific procedural challenge centered on the concept of federal preemption. This is not a dispute over the factual allegations of the business records themselves, but rather a structural question regarding the authority of a state prosecutor to charge a former president for actions that occurred during his tenure in the White House. The central mechanism at play here involves the federal officer removal statute. Legal analysts note that this statute allows for criminal prosecutions commenced in a state court to be moved to the federal court system if the defendant was acting under the color of office. The filing suggests that the defense is arguing the alleged conduct, specifically the management of payments and records, was intertwined with the logistical operations of the presidency. While this might appear to be a technicality, the institutional implications are profound. If the case were successfully moved to federal jurisdiction, it would invoke a different set of legal standards and potentially broaden the scope of immunity defenses available to the defendant. Observers highlight that this strategy places the court in a complex position. The judiciary must now determine where the line is drawn between private conduct and official acts. The district attorney's office has maintained that the charges relate strictly to private business affairs and campaign activity, which traditionally fall outside the scope of official presidential duties. However, the defense's motion forces a re-examination of how broadly official duties can be interpreted. This creates a distinct tension between state sovereignty in enforcing criminal law and federal protections for executive branch officials. Furthermore, this procedural move introduces significant variables regarding the timeline of the trial. Resolving jurisdictional questions often requires appellate review, which can pause or slow proceedings in the lower court. Legal experts caution that this does not necessarily predict the success of the motion, but it does signal a shift from factual defense to constitutional defense. The question currently facing the court is whether the specific acts alleged in the indictment can be legally severed from the office of the presidency or if they are protected by the supremacy of federal law. As this legal countermove unfolds, the immediate focus for observers is how the state court will respond to the federal questions raised. The stability of the legal process depends on a clear resolution of these jurisdictional boundaries before the case can proceed on its merits. Following the unsealing of the indictment, the legal focus has shifted entirely to the defense's procedural counter strategy. The former president's legal team has introduced a multifaceted challenge aimed at dismissing the charges before a jury is ever seated. This approach relies heavily on technical interpretations of New York penal law rather than factual disputes about the events in question. The primary legal argument centers on the novelty of the prosecution's theory. The defense contends that elevating falsification of business records, typically a misdemeanor, to a felony requires an underlying crime that the Manhattan District Attorney does not have clear jurisdiction to prosecute. They argue that applying federal election law as the predicate crime in a state court creates a jurisdictional conflict that has not been previously tested in New York appellate courts. Simultaneously, the defense is targeting the statute of limitations. Under standard New York law, the time frame for prosecuting these specific records charges would have expired. The prosecution relies on a provision that pauses or tolls this clock during periods when a defendant is outside the state. The defense challenges this application, arguing that serving as president in Washington, D.C. should not legally count as fleeing justice or evading jurisdiction for the purposes of the statute. Another layer of the strategy involves constitutional due process claims. The motion suggests that the indictment failed to provide sufficient notice of the specific underlying crimes the defendant intended to conceal. By arguing that the charges are unconstitutionally vague, the legal team seeks to invalidate the case on the grounds that it hinders the defendant's ability to prepare an adequate defense, a fundamental right under both state and federal constitutions. Institutional observers note that these filings serve a dual purpose, challenging the legal merits and impacting the procedural calendar. Each motion requires written responses from the district attorney's office and subsequent rulings by Judge Juan Merchan. If the judge denies these motions, the defense may seek permission for an interlocutory appeal, a process that asks a higher court to review a specific legal ruling before the trial concludes. This phase of the proceedings highlights the friction between state prosecutorial power and federal definitions of conduct. The court must now determine whether a state prosecutor can effectively enforce federal standards through local penal codes. Legal analysts are closely watching to see if the judge will schedule oral arguments to debate these technical points or issue a ruling based solely on the written briefs. The resolution of these pretrial motions will determine whether the case proceeds to jury selection or faces indefinite delay pending appellate review. As the initial procedural dust of the indictment settles, the legal focus has shifted to the multi-pronged defense strategy deployed by former President Donald Trump's team. The centerpiece of this phase is not the factual events of the case, but the technical and constitutional viability of the charges themselves. Defense attorneys have introduced a series of motions challenging the jurisdiction of Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, arguing that the prosecution oversteps state authority boundaries. A primary component of this strategy involves the attempt to move the case from state court to federal court, a maneuver known as removal. The argument here rests on the assertion that the conduct in question related to official duties of the presidency, which would afford different legal protections. While federal judges typically scrutinize such requests heavily, the filing serves a significant purpose in establishing a narrative of federal interplay versus state autonomy. Simultaneously, the defense is targeting the core legal theory that underpins the elevation of the charges from misdemeanors to felonies. Under New York law, falsifying business records is typically a misdemeanor, but it becomes a felony if done to conceal another crime. Legal analysts note that the definition of this other crime remains a procedural sticking point. Trump's team argues that if the underlying offense is a federal election law violation, state prosecutors may lack the jurisdiction to enforce it. This raises an unprecedented institutional question. Can a state court adjudicate a case that relies on the interpretation of federal election statutes? This uncertainty creates a complex battleground for pretrial hearings. Beyond jurisdictional arguments, procedural challenges regarding the statute of limitations have been raised. The events in question took place several years prior to the indictment, exceeding standard time limits for many state charges. However, New York law allows for tolling or pausing the clock when a defendant is continuously outside the state. The application of this provision to a former president who resided in Washington, D.C. due to public duty presents a novel legal scenario for the judge to resolve. Observers are watching closely to see how the court interprets these tolling rules, as a ruling could dismiss charges entirely on technical grounds before a jury is ever seated. Institutional tension is further heightened by arguments surrounding the gag order. The defense has framed restrictions on the former president's speech as a First Amendment issue, arguing that they impede his ability to campaign. This creates direct friction between the court's interest in maintaining order and protecting jurors versus the political rights of a presidential candidate. Legal scholars emphasize that balancing these competing interests requires careful judicial navigation to avoid the appearance of bias while ensuring process integrity. As these motions sit before Judge Juan Merchan, the judiciary faces the pressure of issuing written rulings that address these novel issues without appearing partisan. The next phase hinges on the court's decisions regarding these motions to dismiss. Legal watchers now await rulings that will define the scope of admissible evidence and whether the case proceeds on its current timeline. In the latest development of the procedural timeline, the legal team representing the former president has formally introduced a counter-strategy focused on jurisdictional authority. This move is not merely a denial of the charges, but a procedural challenge to the New York State Court's power to oversee the case. The core of this legal argument rests on the federal officer removal statute, a provision that allows federal officials to transfer legal proceedings from state to federal court if the alleged conduct relates to their official duties. Invoking this statute raises a complex legal question regarding the boundary between private conduct and the official responsibilities of a sitting president at the time the events occurred. Legal analysts note that this maneuver holds significant tactical implications. If the case is successfully moved to the federal court system, it could materially alter the composition of the jury pool and the applicable procedural rules. In federal court, the jury selection area would be broader than the Manhattan jurisdiction where the case is currently lodged. Furthermore, this transfer allows the defense to introduce arguments regarding federal immunity, a legal protection that may be unavailable or harder to apply in a state venue. This is a technical step designed to test the scope of constitutional protections afforded to the executive branch. The prosecution is expected to vigorously oppose this motion, arguing that the alleged acts involving business records and payments were private matters entirely distinct from the functions of the presidency. This debate places the court in a legal gray area where a judge must determine whether signing business documents falls within the color of office for a federal official. This is not just a matter of the facts of the case, but of statutory interpretation. The process of resolving this jurisdictional dispute has the potential to decelerate the timeline of the trial itself, as parties must present evidence and arguments before any ruling on the merits of the indictment can proceed. For the judicial system, this challenge represents a friction point between state police power and federal authority. The court must now weigh whether allowing a state to prosecute a former president for acts occurring during their tenure infringes upon the separation of powers. Observers are closely watching how the judge will schedule hearings on this specific motion. Any decision at this stage has the potential to set a precedent for future interactions between local prosecutors and high-ranking federal officials. Ultimately, the primary uncertainty now lies not in the final verdict, but in the procedural calendar. Jurisdictional motions often carry the right to interlocutory appeals, which can extend the process by months. As the public awaits clarity, the court system is taking cautious steps to ensure the proceedings adhere strictly to due process. The central open question remains whether state-level oversight mechanisms can fully apply to a figure who held the highest executive office, and the answer to this will shape the next phase of the litigation.